have absolutely seen people of color hired and then put in an impossible position, sabotage the resources, and then they obviously, I wouldn't even call it a fail because it's not their fault, but they're blamed for it. And then they're replaced with a white person. I would argue this is related to the glass cliff. And before anybody comes at me, this is race and gender targeted because when white men fail, it is not assumed that all white men can't do things. And they usually get a golden parachute on the way out. Think of the Boeing CEO recently. The glass cliff is when women and or racial, ethnic, underrepresented group members are put into leadership positions when the company is in a time of severe crisis and they don't think it can make it. Some suspect that is what's happening with Boeing right now. Boeing has had so many fails in the past few years that it is looking like impossible it'll ever regain the public's trust. So who has a shot to be CEO now? A woman for the first time in the company ever. And you're like, Anna, you're talking about women examples. This was a racial question. I honestly, there are so few people of color in executive positions this high that it's hard to think of examples, though I welcome them. But I've seen this on much smaller scale. I've talked on here about the company that I left voluntarily because it was so explicitly racist. And I worked against it to try to make it better. And I was very explicit with the leadership, more explicit than anybody else could have been. And I didn't get fired while other people were fired for menial offenses. And yes, they were always people of color. Within this same company, the only woman of color in power was the DEI program manager. She was Latina, and she was never allowed to work on actual program manager things. She was always given a ton of other things. She was working like 80 to 100 hours a week, but never on her program because the CEO or the CEO's right-hand woman would call and give her all this other stuff. And then after months of running her into the ground, they fired her because she didn't meet their qualifications. There was also a black man who they put in charge of a project, and the project was literally impossible. It was to create an entire training program, like a 6-week program of training content in fewer than 80 hours of billable time. That is what they had written to the contract, and that is what they charged the client for. So not only did they not include any other expertise in the beginning of when they wrote that contract and were developing it, which is best practice and bare minimum inclusion, they assigned this impossible project to the black man. And then when he didn't meet that because it was impossible, he wasn't performing. And we were all scrambling to try to help him, like helping him find any pre-made slides we had, trying to collaborate and volunteer our time because he couldn't let us bill the time. He didn't have the billable time. But it was a truly terrible, pointless situation. And I have full belief that it was to try to make the people of color in the organization look less capable, to make excuses for why they were used for their content and then terminated. And the irony was they could have made more money if they had built that project appropriately. Like, that's an expensive program. But they had their hate vision on, and I wondered about stupid vision too.